Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The prisoner's dilemma: why rational people choose worse outcomes. Two criminals are arrested, held in separate cells, cannot communicate, and the prosecutor offers each the same deal. Testify against your partner and you go free while your partner gets 10 years, or stay silent, and if your partner also stays silent, you both get 1 year for a lesser charge. But if you stay silent and your partner testifies, then you get 10 years and your partner goes free. And if you both testify, you both get 5 years, and each prisoner must decide independently, without knowing what the other will choose. And the rational analysis is straightforward. From each prisoner's perspective, testifying dominates staying silent. If your partner stays silent, you get freedom by testifying versus 1 year by staying silent. And if your partner testifies, you get 5 years by testifying versus 10 years by staying silent. So regardless of what your partner does, you're better off testifying. And since both prisoners reason this way, both testify, both get 5 years, and yet if both had stayed silent, both would have gotten only 1 year. And so rational individual decision-making produces a collectively worse outcome. And this is the prisoner's dilemma, one of the most important concepts in game theory, a demonstration that individual rationality can lead to collective irrationality, that pursuing self-interest can harm everyone, including yourself. And the dilemma has applications across economics, politics, environmental policy, international relations, and reveals fundamental tensions between individual and collective good, between rationality and cooperation. Imagine being one of the prisoners, sitting in the cell, considering your options, and you reason: if I stay silent, I get either 1 year if my partner stays silent, or 10 years if my partner testifies. And if I testify, I get either freedom if my partner stays silent, or 5 years if my partner testifies. And comparing these, testifying is better in both cases, gives me a better outcome regardless of what my partner does. And this is a dominant strategy, a strategy that is best no matter what others do. And rationality seems to require choosing your dominant strategy. And so you testify, and your partner reasons the same way, also testifies, and you both get 5 years, and looking back you realize that if you had both stayed silent, you would both be better off, would both get only 1 year, but you had no way to ensure your partner would stay silent, no way to trust. And without trust, the rational choice is to testify, even though cooperation would benefit both. The prisoner's dilemma demonstrates the difference between Nash equilibrium, a state where no player can improve by changing strategy unilaterally, and Pareto optimality, a state where no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. And in the dilemma, both testifying is a Nash equilibrium because neither prisoner can improve by switching to silence if the other is testifying. But both testifying is not Pareto optimal because both could be better off if both stayed silent. And this divergence between equilibrium and optimality is what creates the dilemma, shows that rational individual decision-making can get stuck in suboptimal outcomes, can fail to reach mutually beneficial cooperation. Visualize the dilemma as a payoff matrix. Rows represent prisoner A's choices, columns represent prisoner B's choices, and the cells show the outcomes. And the structure reveals that mutual cooperation yields better outcomes than mutual defection. But cooperation is risky, is vulnerable to exploitation, and defection is safe. Is the rational choice if you cannot trust your partner. And the dilemma captures this tension between cooperation and defection, between trusting others and protecting yourself. And this tension is ubiquitous, appears in countless real-world situations, from arms races to environmental agreements to business competition. The prisoner's dilemma has multiple variants. Iterated prisoner's dilemma, where the same players interact repeatedly. An iteration changes the analysis because future interactions create incentives for cooperation, create opportunities for reputation building and retaliation, and strategies like tit for tat, where you cooperate initially and then mirror your partner's previous choice, perform well in iterated games, achieve cooperation through reciprocity. And this shows that repeated interaction can solve the dilemma, can enable cooperation even among self-interested rational agents. And real-world interactions are often repeated, are embedded in ongoing relationships, and this repetition facilitates cooperation, makes trust possible. Another variant is the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, also called the tragedy of the commons, where many individuals face the choice between cooperating, restraining themselves for collective benefit, or defecting, pursuing individual benefit at collective cost. And examples include overfishing, pollution, climate change, where each individual's rational self-interest leads to collective disaster. And the tragedy of the commons shows that the prisoner's dilemma scales applies to large groups. And the problem is even harder with many players because coordination is more difficult, free riding is easier, and collective action problems arise, and solving these requires institutions, requires mechanisms for enforcement, for monitoring, for punishing defectors. And this is why societies have laws, have regulations, have enforcement mechanisms, because voluntary cooperation is difficult to sustain in large groups facing prisoners' dilemmas. The dilemma also has implications for moral philosophy, for understanding ethics and rationality, because the dilemma shows that rationality and morality can conflict, that the rational choice is to defect, to pursue self-interest, but the moral choice is to cooperate, to consider collective welfare. And this conflict challenges theories that equate rationality with morality, shows that purely self-interested rationality is insufficient for social welfare, requires supplementation with moral considerations, with concern for others, and various moral theories respond differently. Consequentialism might argue that the rational thing is to cooperate because outcomes matter. Contractarianism might argue that rational agents would agree to constraints on defection to avoid mutual harm, and virtue ethics might argue that cooperating reflects good character, even if not strictly rational, in narrow self-interest. One lesson from the prisoner's dilemma is the importance of institutions, of mechanisms that change incentives, that make cooperation rational, and laws that punish defection, contracts that bind parties, monitoring systems that detect cheating, all serve to solve prisoners' dilemmas. All transform situations where defection is rational into situations where cooperation is rational. And understanding the dilemma helps design better institutions, helps create systems where individual incentives align with collective good, and much of economics and political science concerns this problem, concerns how to structure institutions to promote cooperation in dilemma-like situations. Another lesson is the importance of communication, of trust building, of reputation, because in real-world dilemmas, players can communicate, can make commitments, can observe each other's behavior over time, and these factors facilitate cooperation, make it easier to coordinate on the cooperative outcome. And experiments show that allowing communication increases cooperation rates dramatically in prisoners' dilemmas. And this is why diplomacy matters, why negotiation matters, why building relationships matters, because these processes enable cooperation even when individual incentives favour defection. The prisoners sit in separate cells, cannot communicate, face the choice, and rational analysis drives them both to testify, to defect, even though cooperation would benefit both. And the dilemma reveals that rationality is not enough, that collective outcomes require more than individual optimization, require cooperation, trust, institutions, repeated interaction, communication, and the prisoner's dilemma remains one of the most important concepts in social science, A simple game that captures fundamental tensions in social life, that shows why cooperation is difficult, why self-interest can be self-defeating, why rational agents can fail to achieve optimal outcomes, and the dilemma persists as a permanent challenge to theories of rationality, to assumptions about markets and institutions, and as a tool for understanding why societies need laws, norms, enforcement, reputation, communication, all mechanisms that help solve dilemmas, that enable cooperation despite individual incentives to defect. And the prisoners testify, and both lose more than they needed to, and the dilemma endures. The predestination paradox. Time folds back on itself in strange ways, and among the strangest is the predestination paradox, a loop where an event in the past is caused by an event in the future, which is in turn caused by the past event, creating a circle of causation with no clear beginning. And yet, unlike other time travel paradoxes, this one involves no contradiction, only an unsettling sense that something is wrong with the very fabric of cause and effect. Imagine a historian who discovers an ancient artifact in a museum, a device whose origins are mysterious and unknown, and the historian becomes obsessed with understanding where it came from. And after years of research, they finally build a time machine and travel back to the era when the artifact should have been created. But upon arriving, they find no trace of it. No one has ever seen or heard of such a device. And in frustration, the historian accidentally leaves their own artifact behind in the past, where it is eventually discovered and placed in a museum, the very museum where the historian first found it centuries later. The artifact has no origin. It was never created. It simply exists in a loop, passed from future to past and back again, and the timeline is perfectly consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no contradiction, no paradox in the classical sense, and yet the mind recoils because it seems that something must have created the artifact, that objects do not simply exist without being made. The predestination paradox is closely related to the bootstrap paradox, but it emphasizes a different aspect of the problem, the idea that events can be predetermined by time travel, that the past is fixed not because of physical laws, but because travelers from the future have already shaped it, and any attempt to change history is doomed to fail because the changes have already happened. They are already part of the timeline. Consider a time traveler who learns of a great disaster and travels back to prevent it, but every action they take to stop the disaster instead contributes to causing it. Their warnings are misunderstood, their interventions backfire, and in the end, the disaster occurs exactly as history recorded. Because the time traveler was always part of that history. Their presence was always woven into the events, and there was never any other possible outcome. This raises profound questions about free will and determinism, because if time travel is possible, and the timeline is self-consistent, then perhaps the future is already written, every choice already made, every action already determined, and the feeling of free will is an illusion, a sensation that accompanies actions that were always going to happen, that could never have happened any other way. Some physicists embrace this view, arguing that the universe is a block where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, and that time travel simply reveals what was always true, that history is immutable, that the timeline is a fixed structure, and we are merely moving through it, experiencing events in sequence, but unable to alter them. Others find this vision disturbing, a denial of agency, a suggestion that nothing we do matters, because it has all already been decided, and they seek alternatives. Perhaps in the many worlds interpretation, where every time travel event creates a new branch, or in models where time is more fluid and the past can genuinely be changed, though such models often struggle to avoid contradictions. The predestination paradox also appears in ancient mythology and philosophy, in the story of Oedipus, who tries to escape a prophecy but instead fulfills it through his very attempts to avoid it, in the idea of fate and destiny that pervades many cultures, the sense that some events are meant to be, that the future shapes the past as much as the past shapes the future. The paradox lingers as a reminder that time is stranger than it appears, that causation may not be as simple as earlier leading to later, that loops and circles might be woven into the structure of reality, and that the question of whether the future is open or closed, whether we are free or determined, may be inseparable from the question of whether time travel is possible, and if so, what kind of time travel the universe permits. The paradox of value, why what we need most costs least. An economist contemplates the nature of value, asks what makes things valuable, what determines worth, and observes a fundamental puzzle that prices seem disconnected from importance, that markets assign high prices to luxuries and low prices to necessities, that goods essential for human flourishing cost little while goods that serve vanity or status cost fortunes. And this is the paradox of value, the broader version of the diamond water paradox, the puzzle that spans across all goods and services. And the paradox asks why healthcare is expensive, while entertainment is cheap in some places and the reverse in others, why teachers are paid less than entertainers, why life-saving drugs are affordable in some markets and unaffordable in others, why the allocation of value by markets seems misaligned with human needs, with moral worth, with social importance. And this paradox has troubled economic thinking since ancient times, has been discussed by philosophers from Aristotle to Marx, and while modern economics offers explanations through supply and demand, through marginal utility, through market equilibrium, the paradox retains moral force, retains the sense that something is wrong, that prices should reflect importance, that markets fail to value correctly, and the paradox of value remains a central challenge for defending market allocation, for justifying price mechanisms, for explaining why efficient markets can produce what seem like perverse valuations. Imagine comparing different goods by their importance to human welfare. And air is essential, sustains life, is necessary for survival, cannot be done without for more than minutes. And yet air is free, has zero price, costs nothing. While gold is non-essential, serves no biological function, is desired only for decoration or a store of value, and yet gold is expensive, costs thousands per ounce, and this comparison illustrates the paradox, shows that necessity and price are inversely related, that the most needed goods are often cheapest and the least needed goods often expensive. And this pattern extends across many goods. Water is cheap, housing varies but is often expensive, healthcare is expensive in many places, education costs are rising, food prices are moderate, while luxuries like jewellery, sports cars, yachts, artwork, all command premium prices. And the pattern suggests that markets value incorrectly, value luxury over necessity, value status over survival. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that market allocation is unjust, is misaligned with human values. The paradox of value demonstrates the tension between exchange value, what markets assign, and use value, what humans need. And Marx emphasized this distinction, argued that capitalism systematically undervalues use value, undervalues goods necessary for life, while overvaluing exchange value, overvaluing goods that serve accumulation. And this misalignment is not accidental, but is structural, is inherent in market systems that allocate based on willingness to pay rather than on need. And those with money can bid up prices of luxuries, while those without cannot bid up prices of necessities. And markets respond to money, not to need. And this explains the paradox. It explains why diamonds are expensive and water cheap. Because those who want diamonds have money to pay high prices, while those who need water cannot afford high prices. And markets clear at prices that balance supply and demand among those with purchasing power, not among all humans with needs. Visualize the paradox as revealing different concepts of value, economic value, defined by market prices determined by supply and demand, and purchasing power, and moral or social value, defined by importance to human welfare, determined by needs and flourishing. And these two concepts diverge, are not aligned. And economic value is amoral, is neutral about what should be valued, reflects only what is valued by those with money to spend, while moral value judges that some goods are more important than others, that necessities matter more than luxuries, that human needs should be prioritized. And the paradox is the gap between these concepts, is the recognition that markets do not track moral value, do not allocate according to importance. And this gap creates the sense that markets are unjust, are inadequate for distributing goods that matter most. One response to the paradox of value is that markets are efficient, are good at allocating resources to maximize satisfaction of preferences weighted by willingness to pay. And while this may not align with moral importance, it is the best available system, is better than alternatives, like central planning, which face information problems and incentive problems. And markets at least respond to decentralized information about preferences, at least allow individuals to make choices. And efficiency does not require tracking moral importance, requires only that resources go to those who value them most as measured by willingness to pay. And this response accepts the paradox, accepts that markets do not and should not track moral value, argues that moral allocation should be achieved through other means, through taxation and redistribution, through public provision of essential goods, through regulation that ensures access to necessities, and markets should be left to allocate efficiently while other institutions address moral concerns. Another response questions whether the paradox is real, argues that necessities actually are valuable, are provided at low cost because markets are efficient at producing them, because competition drives prices down, and the reason necessities are cheap is that we have solved the production problem, have made them abundant, and abundance is good, is the goal. And the paradox mistakes low price for low value, confuses market price with social importance. And in fact, low prices for necessities mean high consumer surplus, mean people benefit greatly from access to cheap necessities. And this is success, not failure. Is markets working well? Not markets failing. And the paradox dissolves once we recognize that low prices for necessities reflect abundance and efficiency rather than lack of value, and high prices for luxuries reflect scarcity and inefficiency rather than high value. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that markets misallocate, argues that essential goods should not be left to markets, should be provided through public systems, through universal healthcare, through public education, through subsidized housing, and markets can allocate luxuries, can determine who gets diamonds and yachts. But necessities are different, require different allocation mechanisms, require ensuring universal access regardless of ability to pay. And this social democratic response uses the paradox to argue for limits on markets, for sectors where market allocation is inappropriate, where public provision is necessary, and the paradox becomes an argument for mixed economies, for market allocation in some domains and public allocation in others. The paradox also appears in labour markets, where compensation seems misaligned with social importance, and teachers are paid less than entertainers, nurses less than financiers, social workers less than lawyers, and this pattern suggests that markets undervalue socially important work, undervalue contributions to welfare and education and care, while overvaluing contributions to entertainment and finance. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that labour markets are unjust, and explaining the pattern requires understanding supply and demand for labour, requires recognising that compensation reflects scarcity and productivity as measured by market value, not social importance, and teachers are abundant relative to demand while CEOs are scarce, and market productivity of CEOs as measured by profit contribution exceeds that of teachers. And these factors determine compensation, not social importance. And this explains the pattern but does not eliminate the moral concern, does not resolve the sense that something is wrong with a system that pays entertainers more than educators. Some argue that the paradox of value reveals limits of price as measure of value, reveals that not everything important can be priced, that some goods resist commodification, that markets are appropriate for some goods and inappropriate for others, and market prices are useful for allocating produced commodities but are inadequate for allocating access to health, education, safety, justice, and these latter goods require different allocation mechanisms, require treating them as rights or entitlements rather than as commodities to be purchased. And the paradox supports this view, supports the idea that markets have limits, that not everything should be for sale, that some forms of value resist market logic. The necessities remain cheap, the luxuries remain expensive, and the paradox persists. Prices diverge from importance, exchange value diverges from use value, markets allocate without regard to need, and the pattern continues, and the paradox of value endures as a permanent feature of market systems, endures as a moral challenge to market allocation, and resolving the tension requires either accepting that markets are amoral, are efficient but not just, and supplementing markets with institutions that ensure access to necessities, or rejecting markets for essential goods, replacing market allocation with public provision. And the paradox remains unresolved and troubling, showing that what we need most costs least, that prices do not track importance, that markets value incorrectly from a moral perspective, even if correctly from an economic perspective, and the paradox endures. The five phenomenon, why motion is an illusion your brain creates. Two lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not two separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the five phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. A fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the five phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. An understanding fee reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation, a perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the five phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded, that what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup. Two dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes, then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see two sequential flashes, but see one dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved. No object traversed the gap. There were only two separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The phi phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by phi sequences. And so phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system, reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of two flashes, but is a holistic interpretation, is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts. And this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And phi became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. and yet fee is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition, and fee sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output, and phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity, and the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences, and the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction, and phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, a useful, accurate illusion usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And phi reveals this and the lights flash on. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, will it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction? But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honour the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority will can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice. Preserve procedure or preserve substance, respect majority, will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance. that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy. Democracy that respects all majority decisions, regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will, and these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority, and this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level, and democratic procedures at another. And procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy. speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival. And different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance. A challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy. And the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The paradox of power. Why having power makes you lose it. A leader gains power through competence, through understanding others' needs, through empathy and social intelligence, through building coalitions and reading situations accurately. And these qualities enable the rise to power, enable winning support, enable navigating social hierarchies, and the leader reaches positions of authority, gains control over resources, gains ability to make decisions affecting others. And then something changes. The experience of having power alters the psychology of the powerful, reduces empathy, reduces perspective taking, increases confidence, increases risk taking. And these changes are the opposite of what brought power, are the erosion of the very qualities that enabled gaining power. And this is the paradox of power, described by psychologist Daché Keltner and others. The finding that power changes people, makes them less attuned to others, less socially intelligent, less effective at the behaviours that won them power. And powerful people become entitled, become overconfident, become less accurate in reading social situations. And these changes lead to misuse of power, lead to decisions that harm subordinates, lead to loss of support, and eventually lead to loss of power itself. And the paradox shows that power contains the seeds of its own destruction, that having power undermines the qualities necessary to maintain power. And this cycle explains the rise and fall of leaders, explains why initial competence gives way to corruption or incompetence, explains why power corrupts. And the paradox has implications for understanding leadership, for recognizing that power is dangerous, that maintaining power requires deliberate effort to preserve the qualities that win power, requires resistance to the psychological effects of having power. Imagine the psychological changes that occur when someone gains power, gains control, gains authority, and research shows that power activates the behavioral approach system, increases focus on rewards, increases willingness to take risks, and simultaneously, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, reduces attention to threats, reduces concern about others' reactions, and these changes make powerful people more action-oriented, more decisive, but also less careful, less considerate. And experiments demonstrate this, show that people primed to feel powerful are more likely to interrupt others, to speak out of turn, to violate social norms, to take what they want without considering others, and powerful people literally see less, attend less to others' emotions, are worse at identifying facial expressions, are less accurate in reading social cues, And this reduced social intelligence is ironic because social intelligence is what typically wins power, is what enables navigating social hierarchies, and power reduces the very capacity that was necessary to gain it. The paradox of power demonstrates that power is self-undermining, that the experience of having power changes people in ways that make them worse at wielding power, that the psychological effects of power include overconfidence, reduced empathy, increased risk-taking, reduced constraint, and these effects lead to mistakes, lead to alienating subordinates, lead to poor decisions, and eventually lead to loss of power. And the cycle repeats. New leaders rise through empathy and social intelligence, gain power, lose these qualities, make mistakes, lose power. And the paradox is that the qualities needed to gain power are different from or opposite to the psychological effects of having power. And this mismatch drives the cycle, drives the rise and fall of leaders. And preventing the cycle requires awareness, requires powerful people to recognize the psychological effects of power and deliberately compensate, deliberately maintain empathy, deliberately attend to others, deliberately resist the natural effects of power. Visualize the paradox as a feedback loop. Gaining power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions alienate supporters. Alienated supporters withdraw support. Withdrawn support leads to loss of power, and the loop is negative, is self-reinforcing, is a cycle that drives powerful people toward downfall. And breaking the loop requires intervention, requires powerful people to resist the psychological effects of power, requires institutional checks that constrain power, requires cultures that maintain accountability, and without such mechanisms, the loop runs its course. Power leads to its own destruction, and the paradox unfolds. One mechanism underlying the paradox is the disinhibition effect, the finding that power reduces inhibition, reduces self-regulation, reduces the internal constraints that normally prevent people from acting on impulses, and powerful people feel freer to do what they want. Feel less constrained by social norms, feel less concerned about consequences, and this freedom can be positive, can enable decisive action, can overcome excessive caution, but it also leads to inappropriate behavior, leads to violations of norms, leads to taking advantage of others, and the disinhibition effect explains many abuses of power, explains why powerful people harass subordinates, why they take liberties, why they feel entitled, and the effect is not intentional malice, but is psychological change caused by having power, is reduced inhibition that allows latent tendencies to manifest. Another mechanism is the decreased perspective taking, the finding that power reduces the ability and motivation to understand others' perspectives, to imagine how situations look from others' viewpoints, and powerful people focus on their own goals, their own needs, and pay less attention to others. And this reduced perspective taking makes powerful people worse at negotiation, worse at building consensus, worse at understanding how their actions affect others, and these deficits undermine effectiveness, undermine leadership, and create the conditions for losing power. And the paradox is complete. Power reduces the social intelligence needed to maintain power. One response to the paradox is institutional design, creating checks on power, creating accountability mechanisms, creating regular reviews or elections that force powerful people to maintain support. And democratic systems embody this, have regular elections that remove leaders who lose support, and corporate boards have review processes. And these institutions mitigate the paradox by making power conditional, by requiring continued demonstration of competence, by preventing the complacency that power breeds. And effective institutions recognize the paradox, recognize that power corrupts, and design around it, create structures that limit the damage caused by the psychological effects of power. Another response is leadership development, training leaders to recognize the paradox, to understand the psychological effects of power, to deliberately maintain empathy, and perspective taking, and research shows that awareness helps, that leaders who understand the paradox are better at resisting its effects, are more likely to maintain the qualities that won them power, and leadership training increasingly includes content about the psychology of power, about the importance of humility, about the need to deliberately attend to others despite the psychological pull towards self-focus. And this training aims to break the cycle, aims to help powerful people resist the natural effects of power. A third response is cultural, creating organizational cultures that value empathy, that reward perspective taking, that punish abuse of power. And some organizations succeed at this, create environments where power does not corrupt, where leaders remain accountable, remain connected to subordinates. And these cultures require work, require deliberate effort to maintain, require norms that constrain power, that make abuse costly, and they require exemplars, require leaders who model healthy use of power, who demonstrate that power can be wielded without corruption. And these cultural interventions show that the paradox is not inevitable, is not deterministic, but can be managed through collective effort. The paradox also connects to ancient wisdom, to the recognition across cultures and eras that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that leaders must guard against the temptations of power. And philosophers from Plato to Confucius recognized the paradox, recognized that power changes people, and their advice remains relevant, remains a warning that power is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that humility is essential, and the paradox of power shows that this ancient wisdom is psychologically accurate, is confirmed by modern research, is not merely moral preaching, but is description of how power actually affects people. The leader rises, gains authority, controls resources, makes decisions, and power begins its work, reduces empathy, increases overconfidence, loosens inhibitions, and the leader becomes less effective, less attuned, more self-focused, makes mistakes, alienates supporters, and the fall begins, and the paradox completes its arc. Power undermines itself. The qualities that won power are lost, and new leaders rise to repeat the cycle, and the paradox of power endures as a permanent feature of leadership, as a psychological reality that must be managed, that must be resisted, that must be constrained through institutions and culture and awareness. And the paradox remains inevitable and destructive unless deliberately countered, unless powerful people recognize the effects and fight them, unless societies build structures that limit the damage and the cycle continues. The rise and fall driven by the paradox that having power undermines the ability to keep it. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness, its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters, and despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The phantom limb. Paradox: why missing body parts still feel present. A soldier loses an arm in combat. The limb is amputated, no longer exists, no longer is connected to the body, and yet the soldier feels the arm, feels it present, feels sensations in fingers that are not there, feels the arm moving, feels it itching, feels pain in the missing hand. And this sensation is vivid, is compelling, is indistinguishable from sensations in real limbs. And this is the phantom limb phenomenon experienced by the vast majority of amputees, where missing body parts continue to be felt, continue to be represented in consciousness. And the paradox is that the brain maintains a representation of a limb that no longer exists, continues to generate sensations attributed to that limb, continues to include it in the body schema, despite clear evidence from vision and from direct inspection that the limb is absent. And this persistence reveals something deep about how the brain constructs body representations, shows that body schemas are not simply reflections of current physical structure, but are neural constructs that can outlive the body parts they represent. And phantom limbs demonstrate that the sense of embodiment is generated centrally, is maintained by brain processes that do not require peripheral input. And the phenomenon raises questions about the relationship between body and brain, about how sensations are localized, about what it means for a body part to be yours when that part no longer exists. Imagine the experience from the inside. You lost your hand months ago. The physical hand is gone, and yet you feel it. Feel the fingers, can feel yourself making a fist, opening the hand, moving fingers that are not there, and these phantom movements feel exactly like real movements, involve the same motor intentions, the same kinesthetic sensations, and sometimes the phantom hand is in uncomfortable positions, cramped or twisted, and you cannot move it, cannot relieve the discomfort, and this frozen phantom is intensely frustrating, is painful, because you feel the limb but cannot control it, cannot adjust it, and the pain is real, is neurological, is generated by the brain but is felt as coming from the missing hand. And this localization is puzzling because there is no hand, no physical location where the sensations could be occurring, and yet the sensations are localized there, are felt as arising from a specific spatial location that happens to be empty. The phantom limb phenomenon reveals that body representations are maintained in the somatosensory cortex, in the motor cortex, in the parietal lobe, and these representations do not simply disappear when a limb is removed, do not automatically update to reflect the new body configuration, and instead the neural circuitry that represented the limb continues to be active, continues to generate activity patterns that are interpreted as sensations in the missing limb, and this persistent activity is what creates phantom sensations, is what maintains the feeling of presence and understanding. This has led to treatments, has led to therapies that attempt to reorganize the somatosensory cortex, to reduce phantom pain by providing feedback that the limb is gone, and mirror therapy, where amputees use mirrors to create the visual illusion that the missing limb is present, has proven effective, helps reduce pain and unfreeze frozen phantoms by providing visual feedback that allows the brain to update its body representation. Visualize the somatosensory cortex as containing a map of the body, a homunculus where different regions represent different body parts, and this map is established during development, is maintained throughout life, and when a limb is amputated, the corresponding region of cortex does not simply go silent, does not become inactive, and instead neighbouring regions begin to invade, begin to colonize the deferented cortex, and inputs from the face or from the remaining arm begin to activate what was formerly hand cortex. And this reorganization is rapid, occurs within weeks and creates strange effects. Touching the face can produce sensations in the phantom hand, stroking the cheek can feel like stroking the missing fingers, and this shows that the cortical representation has been invaded, that face inputs now activate hand cortex, and the sensations are still localized to the phantom because the activity occurs in hand cortex, and the brain interprets activity in hand cortex as indicating sensations in the hand regardless of the actual source of the activity. The phantom limb paradox challenges the idea that sensations are simply caused by peripheral stimulation, shows that sensations can be generated centrally, can arise from brain activity without corresponding peripheral events, and this has implications for understanding pain, for recognizing that pain is not simply a signal from damaged tissue, but is a constructed experience that can occur without tissue damage, and chronic pain. Phantom pain, neuropathic pain are all examples of centrally generated sensations, are pains that arise from neural processes rather than from peripheral injury, and understanding phantom limbs helps understand these pain conditions, helps develop treatments that target the central nervous system rather than the periphery. The phenomenon also raises philosophical questions about the extended mind, about whether the body is part of the mind or is merely a tool used by the mind, and phantom limbs suggest that the body representation is part of the mind, is a core component of self-representation, and the representation persists even when the body part is gone. And this shows that the mind includes representations of the body, includes body schemas that are not simply passive reflections of physical structure, but are active constructs that shape experience. And the phantom limb is a representation without a referent, is a body part in the mind, but not in the world. And this dissociation shows that minds represent bodies, and representations can outlive what they represent. One variant of phantom limbs occurs in congenital amputees, people born without limbs, and some congenitally limbless individuals report phantom limbs, report feeling limbs they never had. And this is surprising, suggests that body schemas are not entirely learned, are not simply acquired through experience with actual body parts, but have some innate component, are partly specified by genetic programs that establish expected body structure. And when these programs run, they generate representations of limbs, even when those limbs never existed. And this shows that body schemas are not simply empirical generalizations from sensory experience, but are structured expectations about what bodies should be like. And the brain generates these representations even in the absence of corresponding body parts. Another implication concerns prosthetics, because if phantom limbs persist, if amputees continue to feel missing limbs, then prosthetics should be designed to interface with these phantom sensations, should provide feedback that is integrated with the phantom, and neuroprosthetics that read motor intentions from the brain or from remaining nerves can be controlled by the phantom, can allow amputees to move prosthetic limbs by moving their phantom limbs. And this creates a seamless interface, allows natural control, and the phantom limb, rather than being a problem, becomes a solution, becomes the interface between brain and prosthetic. And understanding phantoms has been crucial for developing advanced prosthetics that feel natural, that are experienced as extensions of the body rather than as external tools. The phantom also appears in other contexts: phantom breasts after mastectomy, phantom genitalia after surgery, phantom teeth after extraction, and all these phantoms reflect the same underlying mechanism, the persistence of neural representations after the represented body parts are removed. And the generality of the phenomenon shows that it is not specific to limbs, but applies to any body part. And body schemas for all body parts can persist as phantoms. And this universality suggests that phantoms reveal a general principle about how brains construct body representations, how these representations are maintained centrally, and how they can become dissociated from physical reality. The amputee feels the hand, phantom fingers that are not there, phantom movements that cannot occur, phantom pain in a location that does not exist, and the paradox persists. The brain maintains a representation despite the absence of the represented, and phantom limbs reveal that bodies are represented in brains, that these representations are stable, are resistant to updating, are constructed during development and maintained throughout life, and removal of body parts does not remove their representations, and the phantom remains, felt but not present, localized but not located, moving but motionless. And the paradox endures as one of the most striking phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that consciousness includes representations that can outlive their reference, that sensations can be generated centrally without peripheral causes, and that the body we feel is not simply the body we have, but is the body the brain represents. And sometimes these diverge and phantoms emerge, ghostly presences of absent limbs, and the phenomenon persists. The potato paradox. A farmer harvests 100 kilograms of potatoes, and these potatoes are 99% water by weight, meaning that only 1 kilogram is solid potato material and 99 kilograms is water. And the farmer leaves the potatoes out in the sun to dry, and after some time the water content has decreased. The potatoes are now 98% water instead of 99%. And the question is posed, how much do the potatoes weigh now? And the intuitive answer is that they have lost a little water, perhaps 1 kilogram, and so they now weigh 99 kilograms, or perhaps 98 kilograms. But this intuition is wildly wrong. The correct answer is that the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. They have lost half their weight, and this shocking result is the potato paradox, a puzzle about percentages and proportions that reveals how badly human intuition handles these concepts. The calculation proceeds as follows: the solid potato material, the non-water part, weighs 1 kilogram both before and after drying. This does not change. The potatoes lose water, but not solid material. And before drying, this 1 kilogram of solid material represents 1% of the total weight, because the potatoes are 99% water and 1% solid. And after drying, this same 1 kilogram of solid material must represent 2% of the total weight, because the potatoes are now 98% water and therefore 2% solid. And if 1 kilogram is 2% of the total weight, then the total weight must be 50 kilograms, because 1 kilogram divided by 2% equals 50 kilograms. And so the potatoes have lost 50 kilograms of water, going from 100 kilograms to 50 kilograms, even though the percentage of water has decreased by only 1 percentage point, from 99% to 98%. The paradox reveals how deceptive percentages can be, how a small change in percentage can correspond to a large change in absolute quantity, and the confusion arises from conflating different reference points. The percentage of water is calculated relative to the total weight, which itself changes as water is lost. And so the meaning of 99% water before drying is different from the meaning of 98% water after drying, because the total weight is different. And this shifting reference point makes the percentage decrease seem small when in fact it corresponds to a massive, absolute loss of water. Another way to see the solution is to focus on the solid material. Before drying, the ratio of water to solid is 99:1, and after drying the ratio is 98:2, which simplifies to 49:1. And since the solid material remains 1 kilogram throughout, the water content must be 49 kilograms after drying, giving a total weight of 50 kilograms. And this calculation makes clear that the ratio of water to solid has nearly halved, from 99 parts water per part solid to 49 parts water per part solid. And this large change in ratio corresponds to the loss of half the total weight. The potato paradox has analogues in many real-world contexts where percentages and proportions are used. In economics, where small percentage changes in large quantities can represent enormous absolute changes. In medicine, where changes in concentrations or doses must be carefully calculated to avoid errors. In environmental science, where changes in atmospheric composition are measured in parts per million but can have large effects. And in all these contexts, the potato paradox serves as a warning that percentage changes can be misleading, that absolute quantities matter, and that careful calculation is necessary to avoid errors. The paradox also illustrates a general principle about proportions, that when the total changes, percentages relative to that total change in non-obvious ways, and that converting between percentages and absolute quantities requires attention to what the percentage is calculated relative to, and failure to track the denominator, failure to notice that the reference point is shifting, leads to systematic errors in reasoning, errors that the potato paradox exemplifies. Some people respond to the potato paradox by rejecting the premise, by arguing that potatoes cannot go from 99% water to 98% water by drying, that the numbers are unrealistic, but this response misses the point. The paradox is a thought experiment designed to illustrate mathematical relationships, and while the specific numbers may be exaggerated for effect, the underlying principle is sound, and similar calculations arise in realistic scenarios involving concentrations, dilutions, evaporations, and mixing, and understanding the potato paradox helps avoid errors in these practical contexts. The paradox is also pedagogically valuable. It is often used to teach proportional reasoning, to help students understand the difference between absolute and relative quantities, to emphasize the importance of identifying what a percentage is calculated relative to, and to show that intuition about percentages is often wrong, that careful calculation is necessary, and that problems involving changing totals require extra care. And students who master the potato paradox gain insight into a whole class of problems involving ratios, proportions, and percentages, problems that appear throughout mathematics, science, economics, and everyday life. The 100 kilograms of potatoes sit in the sun, water evaporating, and the percentage of water drops from 99 to 98. A change that sounds small, that feels negligible, and yet the weight has halved. 50 kilograms of water have disappeared, and the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. And this result shocks, violates expectation, reveals the gap between how percentages sound and what they mean, and the paradox endures, a simple problem with a surprising answer, a calculation that seems wrong but is right, a demonstration that percentages are tricky, that proportions shift in non-obvious ways, and that human intuition about these matters is unreliable, needs correction, needs training, needs the discipline of mathematics to avoid systematic error. And the paradox remains, taught in classrooms, discussed in puzzles, a permanent reminder that numbers are subtle, that context matters, that reference points shift, and that the gap between 99% and 98%, which sounds like 1%, can actually represent 50% of the total. And the potatoes shrink, the water evaporates, and the weight drops, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a lesson in proportional reasoning wrapped in a story about potatoes and sunshine. The paradox of free will, why choice seems both real and impossible. A person stands at a crossroads, two paths diverging, and must choose which way to go. And the person deliberates, weighs options, considers consequences, and makes a decision, chooses one path. And this choosing feels free, feels like the person could have chosen otherwise, like the decision was truly up to them, genuinely within their control. And yet the person's decision is the result of brain processes, is caused by prior states of neurons, by chemical reactions, by electrical signals, and these processes are themselves caused by earlier states, by genetics and experience and current circumstances, and the chain of causation extends back through the person's life, through evolution, through the physical history of the universe. And at no point in this causal chain is there a break, a moment where cause gives way to free choice, where determinism is suspended. And if every event has causes, if the present is determined by the past plus the laws of physics, then the person's decision was determined long before the moment of choosing, was inevitable given prior conditions. And the feeling of free choice is an illusion. The decision was never really up to the person, could not have been otherwise. And this creates the paradox of free will, the apparent incompatibility between the subjective experience of freedom and the objective reality of causal determination. Between the feeling that we choose and the fact that our choices are caused, and this paradox has troubled philosophers for millennia, generated enormous literature, produced multiple attempted solutions, but never achieved consensus. And the problem persists as one of the central questions in philosophy, ethics, and the nature of human agency. Imagine the person's brain at the moment of decision, neurons firing in specific patterns, dopamine and serotonin modulating activity, and these patterns cause the decision, determine which path is chosen, and the patterns themselves were caused by prior brain states, by sensory inputs, by memories activated, by emotional states, and these prior states had their own causes, and the causal chain is unbroken, and nowhere in this chain is there room for free will, for choices that are not caused, for decisions that could have been different given exactly the same prior conditions. And if determinism is true, if the laws of physics determine everything, then free will seems impossible, seems to be a conceptual confusion, and yet the feeling of freedom persists, and we hold people responsible for their actions, praise and blame them, treat them as if their choices were free, and the legal system, morality, social practices all assume free will, assume that people could have done otherwise. And the paradox is that free will seems both necessary for responsibility and impossible given causation. The paradox generates three main positions: compatibilism, which says free will is compatible with determinism; incompatibilism, which says they are incompatible; and libertarianism. Not political libertarianism, but metaphysical libertarianism, which accepts incompatibility and argues that determinism is false, that humans have genuine free will, and different philosophers defend each position with different arguments, and no consensus emerges, and the debate continues, and the paradox remains unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, and this might reflect a deep feature of human existence, that we cannot escape the feeling of freedom even if we become convinced intellectually that freedom is impossible, that the first-person perspective of deliberation requires treating ourselves as free even if the third-person perspective of science shows that we are determined. Visualize determinism as a timeline. The state of the universe at one time, plus the laws of physics, determines the state at the next time. And this determination is complete, includes everything, includes brain states and decisions, and the timeline is like a film that has already been recorded, and we are living through it, experiencing events as they unfold. But the sequence is fixed, was fixed by initial conditions billions of years ago, and our decisions as frames in this film are determined by previous frames. And no alternative timeline is possible given the initial conditions and the laws. And if this picture is correct, then the feeling of having options, of being able to choose differently, is illusory. We could not have chosen differently. The decision was already encoded in the prior state of the universe, and we are not free. Compatibilists respond that this picture misunderstands what free will requires, that free will does not require the ability to have chosen differently given exactly the same prior conditions, does not require breaking the causal chain, but only requires that our choices flow from our own desires, values, character, that we are not coerced, not forced, not manipulated, and as long as the person's decision resulted from their own deliberation, their own reasons, they acted freely, even though their deliberation was caused, even though their reasons were determined. And free will is compatible with determinism because free will is about the source of action, about whether it comes from the agent's own psychology, not about whether it is uncaused. Incompatibilists reject compatibilism, argue that if determinism is true, then everything we do was determined by factors beyond our control, by genetics we did not choose, by environments we did not create, by causal chains that began before we were born, and we are not genuinely responsible for actions that were determined by factors beyond our control. And compatibilist free will is not real freedom, but is a verbal trick, is redefining freedom to make it compatible with determinism, and genuine freedom, the kind required for moral responsibility, requires that we could have done otherwise, requires that our choices are not determined. And since determinism is probably true, given physics, genuine free will probably does not exist, and moral responsibility is problematic. Libertarians argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics shows that the universe is not deterministic, that there is genuine randomness, genuine indeterminacy at the quantum level, and this indeterminacy allows for free will, allows for choices that are not determined by prior states. But critics respond that randomness is not freedom, that random neural processes do not give us control over our actions, do not make us responsible, and adding randomness to determinism does not create free will, creates only determinism plus chance, and neither determination nor chance gives us the control required for responsibility. The paradox of free will also has practical implications for criminal justice, for morality, for how we treat each other, because if free will is an illusion, then punishment seems unjustified, seems cruel, and blame seems inappropriate, and we should respond to harmful behaviour with rehabilitation or prevention rather than retribution. And yet the practice of holding people responsible seems essential to social life, seems unavoidable even if philosophically problematic. And we continue to blame and praise, punish and reward, as if free will exists, and perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps human social life requires treating people as responsible, even if the metaphysical foundations are shaky. The person stands at the crossroads, deliberates, chooses, and walks down one path, and whether this choice was free remains disputed, remains one of philosophy's hardest questions, and the paradox endures. Free will seems both essential and impossible, both real and illusory, and the tension between these perspectives remains unresolved, and perhaps the tension is permanent, is a feature of human existence that cannot be eliminated, that we must live with the subjective feeling of freedom while recognizing the objective reality of causation, and the paradox of free will persists as a permanent puzzle about human agency, about responsibility, about whether we are authors of our actions or merely characters in a predetermined story. And the question remains open, continues to generate debate, continues to matter for ethics and law and self-understanding. And the crossroads remains, the paths diverge, the choice is made, and whether it was truly free remains one of philosophy's deepest and most enduring questions. The paradox of confirmation. Why seeing a red apple proves all ravens are black. A scientist seeks to confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black, and the obvious way to test this hypothesis is to observe ravens, to find ravens and check their colour. And each black raven found provides evidence for the hypothesis, confirms it slightly, makes it more likely to be true. And this seems straightforward, seems like basic scientific method. Observe instances that match the hypothesis and they provide confirmation. But philosopher Carl Hempel noticed something strange, something that reveals how confirmation works in unexpected ways. And the strangeness begins with a logical equivalence. The statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to the statement, all non-black things are non-ravens. These two statements have exactly the same truth conditions. If one is true, then the other must be true. If one is false, then the other must be false. And so anything that confirms one statement should confirm the other, should provide equal evidence for both. But now consider what confirms the statement. All non-black things are non-ravens, and observing a non-black non-raven should confirm it. Observing a red apple provides evidence that all non-black things are non-ravens because a red apple is non-black and is a non-raven. And since all non-black things are non-ravens is equivalent to all ravens are black, observing a red apple should confirm that all ravens are black. And this seems absurd, seems like observing apples in your kitchen has nothing to do with the colour of ravens. And yet the logic is impeccable. And this is the paradox of confirmation, also called Hempel's paradox or the raven paradox. A puzzle about how evidence works, about what confirms scientific hypotheses, and about whether our intuitions about confirmation can be trusted. Imagine a scientist sitting in a laboratory surrounded by red apples, carefully noting each one, recording that it is red and not a raven, and claiming that this investigation provides evidence about ravens, evidence that all ravens are black. And this seems ridiculous. Seems like the scientist has confused what is relevant to the hypothesis, has mistaken irrelevant observations for genuine evidence, and yet the logical structure is clear. Each red apple confirms that all non-black things are non-ravens, and this statement is logically equivalent to all ravens are black. And confirmation should be closed under logical equivalence. If observation O confirms hypothesis H, and H is equivalent to H, then O should confirm H out, otherwise confirmation would depend on how we phrase hypotheses rather than on what they say. And so the scientist with the red apples is doing legitimate science, is confirming a hypothesis about ravens even though no ravens are involved. And the paradox forces us to either accept this counterintuitive conclusion or reject some principle we thought was obvious about how confirmation works. The paradox reveals tension between formal logic and intuitive judgment. Because formally the argument is valid, red apples do confirm that all ravens are black through the equivalence with all non-black things are non-ravens, but intuitively this seems wrong. Seems like red apples are irrelevant to ravens, and resolving this tension requires either explaining why the formal conclusion is actually correct and our intuitions are misleading, or showing where the formal argument goes wrong, where a principle we thought was valid actually fails. And both options have been pursued, have generated extensive philosophical literature, have produced multiple proposed solutions, none of which has won universal acceptance. Visualize the logical space of all objects, divided into 4 categories: black ravens, which confirm the hypothesis directly; non-black ravens, which would falsify the hypothesis; black non-ravens like coal or blackboards, which seem irrelevant; and non-black non-ravens like red apples, which also seem irrelevant. And the paradox says that observing objects in the 4th category, non-black non-ravens, provides evidence for the hypothesis that all ravens are black, because these observations confirm the equivalent hypothesis that all non-black things are non-ravens, and each red apple, each green leaf, each blue car provides a tiny bit of evidence that ravens are black. And while this sounds absurd, it follows from principles of confirmation that seem undeniable. One proposed solution appeals to background knowledge and prior probabilities, argues that red apples do confirm that all ravens are black, but the confirmation is so tiny as to be practically negligible. Because we have vast background knowledge about the number of non-black things in the universe, we know there are billions and billions of non-black objects, and observing one red apple increases our confidence that all non-black things are non-ravens by an infinitesimal amount, whereas we have much less background knowledge about ravens, and observing one black raven increases our confidence that all ravens are black by a larger amount. And so both observations provide confirmation, but in vastly different degrees. And this explains why it seems pointless to observe red apples when investigating raven colour. Not because they provide no confirmation, but because they provide so little confirmation that the exercise is worthless. And this Bayesian solution preserves the formal logic while explaining the intuition, accepts that red apples confirm the hypothesis, but explains why we correctly ignore them. Another solution challenges the equivalence condition, argues that confirmation is not closed under logical equivalence, that logically equivalent statements can receive different confirmation from the same observation. And the reason is that confirmation depends not just on logical form, but on the way hypotheses are stated, on which predicates are used, on how the hypothesis carves up the world, and all ravens are black, and all non-black things are non-ravens, while logically equivalent organise the world differently, make different predicates primary, and observations confirm hypotheses relative to these organisations, and a black raven confirms the first hypothesis more than the second, and a red apple confirms the second more than the first, even though they are equivalent. And this solution rejects the principle that equivalent hypotheses must receive equal confirmation from the same observation. A third solution appeals to selective confirmation, argues that observing a red apple provides some evidence for all ravens are black, but only under certain conditions, only when the observation is made in a context where it has the potential to falsify the hypothesis. And seeing a red apple in your kitchen where you never expected to find a raven provides no confirmation, provides no new information. But seeing a red apple in a context where you might have found a non-black raven, where the observation had the potential to reveal a counterexample, does provide confirmation. And so confirmation depends not just on what is observed, but on the circumstances of observation, on what was at stake, on what alternatives were possible. And this solution ties confirmation to potential falsification, treats confirmation as depending on whether observations eliminate possibilities rather than merely matching hypotheses. The paradox also connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's problem of how we can justify inferring from observed instances to unobserved cases, because confirming all ravens are black by observing black ravens assumes that the future will resemble the past, that unobserved ravens will be like observed ravens, and this assumption itself cannot be justified without circularity. And the paradox adds another layer, shows that even if we accept induction, we face puzzles about what counts as confirming evidence, about whether observations of non-ravens can tell us about ravens, and these puzzles reveal that confirmation is more complex than it appears, cannot be reduced to simple pattern matching or accumulation of positive instances. The scientist with the red apples continues recording, carefully noting each observation, and the paradox hangs over the investigation, a question about whether this absurd procedure is actually legitimate science, whether red apples really do provide evidence about ravens, and the answer depends on how we understand confirmation, on which principles we accept, on whether we follow formal logic or intuitive judgment, and the paradox remains unresolved in the sense that different solutions appeal to different intuitions, make different trade-offs, and no consensus has emerged, only a recognition that confirmation is subtle, that evidence works in non-obvious ways, that formal principles can lead to counterintuitive conclusions, and that the relationship between observation and theory, between data and hypothesis, between evidence and confirmation, is more complex than common sense suggests, and Hempel's paradox endures as a classic problem in philosophy of science, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of scientific method, a reminder that even basic concepts like confirmation and evidence conceal difficulties that philosophy has not fully resolved. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers, and those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession, and in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before because their incomes have fallen, and so the collective attempt to increase savings fails. Defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades. though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behaviour that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced, and this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security, and this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution, and this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine, or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments, and these investments create jobs and income, and so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behaviour can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways, and this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear: we should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate, Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others. But it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility, And these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes: unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance, for all its virtues, is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The Preface Paradox. An author completes a lengthy scholarly work, a book synthesizing years of research, containing hundreds of individual claims about history, science, or philosophy, and the author has carefully checked each claim, believes each one to be true, based on the available evidence, and yet in the preface, the author writes something like this: "Despite my best efforts, I am certain that this book contains errors, that some of the claims I have made are false, and I apologize in advance for any mistakes that careful readers may discover." This acknowledgement is standard, even expected in academic writing, a gesture of intellectual humility, an admission that no human work is perfect. That error is inevitable in any sufficiently complex undertaking, and yet this creates a paradox, because the author believes each individual claim in the book believes that claim 1 is true, that claim 2 is true, that claim 3 is true, and so on for all the claims, and belief is usually thought to be closed under conjunction, meaning that if you believe each of several propositions, then you should believe their conjunction. And so the author should believe that all the claims in the book are true, and yet the author also believes that at least one of the claims is false, that not all of them are true, and these two beliefs are contradictory. And so the author holds contradictory beliefs, and this seems irrational. Yet the author's behaviour seems entirely reasonable. Both the individual beliefs and the belief that some of them are false seem justified. And so the preface paradox reveals a tension between rationality and consistency, between what it is reasonable to believe and what logic says about the relationships between beliefs. The paradox was first articulated clearly by David Mackinson in 1965, though related issues had been discussed earlier, and it challenges the principle that rational belief is closed under conjunction, that if you rationally believe P and rationally believe Q, then you must rationally believe P and Q, because in the preface case, the author rationally believes each claim individually, but rationally believes that their conjunction is false, or at least that the conjunction is likely to contain errors. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that it is possible to rationally believe many individual propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the number of propositions is large and the probability that each is true, while high, is less than certainty. Because if each claim has a 99% chance of being true, then a book with 100 claims has only about 37% chance of having all its claims be true, and so it is perfectly rational to believe each claim while doubting that all are true. Another response is to distinguish between degrees of belief, arguing that the author assigns high credence to each individual claim, perhaps 99%, but assigns lower credence to the conjunction of all the claims, and that there is no contradiction here, only a recognition that confidence decreases as the number of independent claims increases. And this response draws on probabilistic or Bayesian approaches to rational belief, where belief comes in degrees rather than being all or nothing, and where the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts, if they are independent, and so the probability that all claims are true can be much lower than the probability that any particular claim is true. A third response is to argue that the author's belief in the preface, the belief that the book contains errors, is of a different kind than the beliefs in the individual claims, that it is a higher order belief about the author's own fallibility rather than a first order belief about the subject matter of the book, and that there is no direct contradiction between believing that you are generally fallible and believing specific claims, just as there is no contradiction in a weather forecaster believing that their forecasts are occasionally wrong while believing that today's forecast is correct. The preface paradox connects to broader issues in epistemology about the nature of rational belief, the role of evidence, the significance of consistency, and whether it is possible for a rational agent to knowingly hold inconsistent beliefs. And while inconsistency is generally considered a mark of irrationality, the preface paradox suggests that there are cases where inconsistency, or at least apparent inconsistency, is unavoidable, and perhaps even required by rationality, because to refuse to acknowledge the possibility of error when error is statistically almost certain would itself be a form of irrationality, a failure to properly calibrate beliefs to the evidence. The paradox also relates to the lottery paradox, another puzzle about rational belief and probability, where you rationally believe of each ticket in a large fair lottery that it will not win, but you also rationally believe that some ticket will win, and again rational belief seems to violate closure under conjunction, and together these paradoxes suggest that the classical logical picture of belief, where beliefs are consistent sets of propositions closed under logical consequence, may not accurately capture how rational agents actually form and maintain beliefs in conditions of uncertainty. The preface paradox has practical implications for how we think about knowledge and expertise, because it suggests that experts, even while justifiably confident in their individual judgments, should maintain an overall humility about the possibility of error. And this humility is not a sign of weakness or uncertainty, but a recognition of the statistical reality of human fallibility. And it supports practices like peer review, replication, and open debate, all of which are mechanisms for catching errors that individual researchers, despite their care and expertise, are likely to make. The paradox also raises questions about the ethics of assertion and testimony, about what it is permissible to assert or to claim as knowledge, because if the author knows that the book contains errors, in the sense of being confident that at least one claim is false, then is it honest to present the book as if all the claims are true, or should every claim be hedged with qualifications and caveats? And if so, would this not make communication impossibly cumbersome? And yet, if we present claims without hedges, do we mislead our audience? Do we pretend to a certainty we do not possess? And these questions have no easy answers, and different contexts may call for different standards of assertion, with scientific writing allowing for the acknowledgement of fallibility in a way that courtroom testimony or medical diagnosis may not. The author sits with the completed manuscript, proud of the work yet aware of its limitations, believing each sentence yet doubting the whole, and this dual attitude, far from being irrational, seems to be the mark of a careful and honest thinker, someone who takes seriously both the evidence for individual claims and the statistical likelihood of error. And the preface paradox forces recognition that rationality is more complex than simple consistency, that the principles governing rational belief must accommodate uncertainty, fallibility, and the limits of human cognition, and that sometimes the rational response to evidence is to hold beliefs that are, in a technical sense, inconsistent. And this inconsistency is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of how finite minds navigate an uncertain world. And the paradox remains, a puzzle that challenges our theories of rational belief, that resists easy resolution, and that reminds us that even the attempt to be perfectly rational, perfectly consistent, perfectly certain, is itself a kind of error, a failure to recognize that error is inevitable, that certainty is elusive, and that the best we can do is to believe what the evidence supports, while acknowledging that some of what we believe must, almost certainly, be false. The philosophical zombie argument, why consciousness might not come from physics. A creature walks among us that looks exactly like a human being, molecule for molecule identical, atom for atom the same, every neuron firing in the same patterns, every behavior perfectly matched. And this creature speaks as we speak, acts as we act, responds to pain by withdrawing, to beauty by smiling, to loss by crying, and yet inside there is nothing. No subjective experience, no consciousness, no inner light, no feeling of what it is like to be this creature, and this being is called a philosophical zombie, or P-zombie, a thought experiment in philosophy of mind that challenges physicalism, challenges the view that consciousness is nothing more than physical processes, and the zombie argument asks us to imagine such creatures, to consider whether they are conceivable, and if they are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible, and if they are possible, then consciousness cannot be identical to physical processes, cannot be reduced to brain states, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And this shows that consciousness is something extra, something additional to the physical. And this is the philosophical zombie argument, deployed by David Chalmers and others to defend property dualism, to argue that subjective experience is not reducible to objective physical facts. And the argument remains one of the most debated arguments in contemporary philosophy of mind. Imagine encountering a zombie, engaging in conversation, watching it navigate the world, and nothing in its behavior betrays the absence of consciousness. It claims to be conscious, describes its experiences in first-person terms, acts exactly as a conscious being would act, and the only difference, the only divergence between zombie and human is the inner life, the presence or absence of subjective experience, and the zombie has none, is dark inside, operates purely through physical mechanisms without any accompanying phenomenology. And the argument asks whether such a being is conceivable, whether we can coherently imagine it, and if we can, then consciousness is not necessitated by physical structure, is not entailed by brain processes, and physicalism fails, and some form of dualism must be true. The argument can be stated formally as follows: it is conceivable that there be zombies, creatures physically identical to humans, but lacking consciousness. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not identical to physical processes. Therefore, consciousness is not identical to physical processes. And this conclusion challenges materialism, challenges the view that everything is physical, that mental states are brain states, and forces recognition of an explanatory gap, a gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts that cannot be bridged by physical explanation alone. Visualize two worlds. One is our world, filled with conscious beings who have inner lives, who experience redness and pain and joy, and the other is zombie world, physically identical. Every particle in the same position, every force acting identically, but lacking consciousness. All beings are zombies, and the question is whether zombie world is possible, whether it is a coherent scenario. And Chalmers argues that it is, that we can conceive of such a world without contradiction, and this conceivability establishes possibility, and possibility refutes physicalism, shows that physical facts do not exhaust all facts, that there are phenomenal facts that are additional to physical facts. Physicalists respond to the zombie argument in multiple ways. The most direct response denies that zombies are conceivable, argues that the apparent conceivability is illusory, that we think we can imagine zombies because we are not thinking carefully enough, not considering all the implications, and that when we try to fill in the details, try to specify exactly how a zombie would work, contradictions emerge, and zombies turn out to be impossible after all. And this response requires showing that consciousness is entailed by physical structure, that given the right physical organization, consciousness must arise. And this is the hard part, explaining why and how physical processes necessitate consciousness. Another response accepts that zombies are conceivable, but denies that conceivability implies possibility, argues that there is a gap between what we can imagine and what is actually possible, that conceivability is an epistemic notion about what seems possible to us, while possibility is a metaphysical notion about what could actually be. And these can come apart. We can conceive of things that are actually impossible, like water being something other than H2O. And Kripke's work on necessity and identity supports this, shows that identities, like water is H2O, are necessary, even though we can conceive of their negation. And the same applies to consciousness, is brain process. It might be necessarily true, even though we can conceive of its negation. And so zombies, while conceivable, are not possible, and the zombie argument fails. A third response argues that the zombie argument begs the question, assumes what it sets out to prove, because the claim that zombies are conceivable assumes that consciousness is something separable from physical processes, something that could be absent while physical processes remain. And this assumption is precisely what physicalists deny. And so the argument does not refute physicalism, but merely asserts an alternative view. And physicalists are not obliged to accept the zombie scenario as genuinely conceivable, can reject it as incoherent or question-begging. The zombie argument connects to other arguments about consciousness, to the knowledge argument about Mary, and to the explanatory gap, and to the hard problem of consciousness, all pointing to the difficulty of explaining subjective experience in physical terms, all suggesting that phenomenal consciousness resists reduction. And these arguments collectively create a case for dualism, for the view that consciousness is not physical, though the case remains controversial, remains rejected by many philosophers who maintain that consciousness will eventually be explained physically, that the apparent gap is due to ignorance, not to genuine irreducibility. The zombie walks through the world, behaving normally, seeming conscious, and yet the question hangs: is there anyone home? Is there subjective experience? Or is the creature an automaton, a sophisticated mechanism that mimics consciousness without having it? And the zombie argument uses this thought experiment to probe the nature of consciousness, to test whether consciousness can be separated from physical structure. And the answer determines whether physicalism is true, whether everything about consciousness can be explained in physical terms, or whether consciousness is something more, something that transcends the physical. And the zombie remains, conceivable or not, possible or not, a thought experiment that continues to challenge materialist theories of mind, continues to force physicalists to explain how consciousness arises from matter, how subjective experience emerges from objective processes, and the philosophical zombie endures as one of the most vivid and controversial thought experiments in philosophy. A creature that may be impossible, but whose mere conceivability threatens physicalism, whose imagined existence reveals the explanatory gap between brain and mind, between matter and consciousness, and whether zombies could exist remains disputed, remains a test case for theories of consciousness. And the zombie argument persists as a central challenge to the view that science can explain everything, that physical facts exhaust all facts, and that consciousness is nothing more than brain processes arranged in certain ways.